bring them over, train them how to teach ASEAN, give them a set of teaching materials, and send them back to their countries to increase the education in ASEAN about ASEAN. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I was told to stand here in case there were questions and answers. But I'm also a great believer in the fundamental right to eat.
Professor Jayakumar and Professor Tommy Koh to please join us for the official launch. We now invite Professor Weiler to present 4 books to Professor Jayakumar. Yes. And Dr. Tian Xian Li will present 4 books to Professor Tommy Koh. Thank you, professors, editors, and authors. The launch of the ASEAN Integration Through Law Book series is now official.
What are the possible institutional models for ASEAN's external trade agreements? Well, there are 3 broad categories. First, combined or common ASEAN member state agreements. This is where rights and obligations are created with the non-ASEAN state, and on the side of ASEAN member states, either no rights are created amongst them, or the rights amongst them are enforced using means within ASEAN. Second, agreements involving ASEAN the organization as a separate party. This would require first that some kind of competence is transferred to ASEAN, and ASEAN could either conclude an agreement alone and in its own right, or drawing on the EU experience of mixity, ASEAN as an organization and its member states together could even conclude mixed ASEAN agreements. Third, ASEAN member state agreements. ASEAN's external trade agreements currently are a variant of this. They are plurilateral in nature, and this means that rights and obligations are created between member states as well as with the dialogue partner. ASEAN itself, however, though a separate legal person, is not a party. The way in which the ASEAN agreements are concluded has legal effects throughout the life of such agreements, from negotiation and conclusion, treaty making, through the possible breach of the agreements and recourse to available remedies. Treaty breaking. Some of these effects may be intended and some may have been unintended. And we examine through the book questions such as, can we improve on the current method of concluding ASEAN agreements to better achieve ASEAN centrality? Are there ways to present ASEAN as a single actor in the process? Is there a way to involve the ASEAN Secretariat? We do not venture to suggest one model trade agreement for ASEAN. Rather, we demonstrate that ASEAN can conclude trade agreements with non-member states in a number of different ways and then analyze their possible impact on the different stages in the life of an agreement. It provides a framework of analysis of the different methods by which ASEAN and its member states have and could conclude trade agreements with non-member states. The framework will be useful to those who examine treaty models, whether they be academic researchers or practitioners, including government officials and advisors. It would also be valuable particularly to those engaged in the comparative study of regional treaty-making practices. Our book offers insight into what might be the potential of ASEAN in the field of external relations in the longer run, and it will appeal to those interested in ASEAN's ability to achieve an ASEAN economic community.
Well, the book that we've been writing, ASEAN External Agreements, shows, or gives us a very interesting story about 10 very, very diverse member states that are acting collectively to negotiate trade and investment agreements. And what we can see from that is that diversity among the negotiating member states often results in lower ambition and less coverage. So that tells us why certain individual ASEAN member states are in fact going out there and negotiating by themselves, and third countries are approaching individual ASEAN member states rather than the ASEAN collective. The internal status quo of ASEAN regional integration in fact provides something like a ceiling to the external agreements. There's none of the external agreements actually in any provision, in any obligation, go further and beyond what ASEAN has internally so far achieved in terms of de jure regional integration in the economic area. The limitation of ASEAN as a collective negotiator of external economic agreements is in fact due to the very, very diverse institutional and economic development levels among its member states. One of the best examples would be to compare institutional and economic development between Myanmar and Singapore. Countries as diverse as this can simply not take on the same obligations and implement them domestically. For that matter, countries that wish for a faster pace, for a speedier integration with third countries outside of the ASEAN collective are in fact highly incentivized to go this alone and to negotiate agreements with those external partners by themselves. What role will ASEAN member states and ASEAN as a collective play in the big big game of trade and investment negotiations that is currently underway? And our finding in this particular instance is that ASEAN has a rather limited role, and what we can expect from RCEP as well is rather limited. And ASEAN member states, in fact, could be better off going alone. At the same time, what we suggest in the book is that there are ways of reconciling individual ASEAN member states agreements with the ASEAN Economic Community as much as the ASEAN plurilateral agreements.
Hi, I'm Edmund Sim, co-author of The Foundation of the ASEAN Economic Community, which I co-wrote with Stefano Inama of UNCTAD. Our book is a review and analysis of the ASEAN Economic Community, an ambitious program of economic integration in Southeast Asia, first set forth by ASEAN leaders and elaborated in the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter says that the ASEAN Economic Community consists of a single production base and a single market, and as articulated by ASEAN leaders, should be established by the end of the year 2015. Our book posits that in reality, the ASEAN Economic Community has already been in existence for many years, particularly in the form of the single production base. Primarily, Japanese automobile and electronics manufacturers have operated within ASEAN in a single production base for many years. What is intended to take place by the end of 2015 is the establishment of the single market and an expansion of the single production base throughout Southeast Asia. However, our book puts forth that the end of 2015 is merely the beginning of a long process of economic integration. That's because the single production base so far has been limited to a relatively small number of large companies, and much of ASEAN's industries have not been able to participate fully in the single production base. Similarly, the single market in ASEAN has not really materialized for many industries because of national barriers and borders. Hence, what is necessary in ASEAN is a form of dealing with post-border entry issues. Dealing with such post-entry issues requires that ASEAN needs to look at one of the two models of regional economic integration that have been most successful. In our book, we compare the ASEAN Economic Community with the European Union, which has strong regional institutions to deal with economic integration. We also look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which instead of having strong institutions, has a very detailed legal text and robust dispute resolution to deal with the issues of economic integration in North America. Our argument in our book is that ASEAN needs to follow one of these two models in order to achieve the full potential of the ASEAN Economic Community. That's because without using either one of these models, or a combination of the two, the ASEAN Economic Community is soon reaching the limits of its institutional and structural capacity to deal with economic integration. So our book provides a series of policy options after reviewing the various problems in the ASEAN Economic Community. These policy options can be reviewed and implemented by ASEAN's leaders over the coming years after 2015. By providing a summary and an overview of the ASEAN Economic Community, our book can also be used as a textbook for training in universities, corporate capacities, and other instances where people want to learn more about the ASEAN Economic Community. And it is our hope that through our book, some of the myths of the ASEAN Economic Community can be dispelled, and that the potential of the ASEAN Economic Community can be fully understood by all the peoples of ASEAN.
The focus of the book is the external relations of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of ASEAN. It presents the first comprehensive account of its international treaty-making practice, but includes also softer legal instruments such as declarations, memoranda of understanding, and plans of action. So why should you read this book? In our research, we found a burgeoning external relations practice of ASEAN. It's really coming of age as an international actor. To date, it has concluded about 200 international agreements and issued instruments with its external partners in the wider region and with strategic partners around the world. This is a thus far untapped resource for researchers both in law and in international relations. And we hope that also the book is a good starting point for further inquiries into ASEAN as an international actor. Some of the key findings of the book are, firstly, that you can distinguish between two main modes of operation in ASEAN external relations. One is ASEAN as an international organization with its own legal personality, own treaty-making powers, but that's just being used in a minority of cases. Our finding was that in most cases, it's the ASEAN member states acting together as a cohesive group, using ASEAN as a collective identity, as a label in interacting with the rest of the world. Another key finding is the kind of sensitivity ASEAN shows towards its member states and external partners in their dealings. Internally, that is well known as the ASEAN way, but we see that this also really translates into the external relations of ASEAN. So it's really becoming a hallmark of ASEAN as a global player. I'm confident that it will remain very active on the global stage. We've seen this as a trend in the last couple of years, and we're quite confident that it will continue this way. So the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is definitely a player to watch in the future.
ASEAN wasn't started as an organization. It was started as a pragmatic measure to create trust amongst countries that had been at war with one another. In 1967, when ASEAN was founded, Indonesia had just ended its confrontation with Malaysia and Singapore. Singapore had just been ejected from the Federation of Malaysia. The Philippines had a claim to Sabah, and in the north, the Vietnam War was raging. So it was essential back then, more than 50 years ago, to create this idea that there was an association, a community of nations. ASEAN developed very pragmatically. It didn't have a constitution. The Bangkok Declaration wasn't even meant to be a treaty. The Bangkok Declaration, which founded ASEAN, basically set up a mechanism for the foreign ministers to meet. And from those modest beginnings, ASEAN started to grow. The main impetus for ASEAN's growth over the last half century was, first